Alright, gang. Alright, gang. Welcome to Hein and Quai. Say Hein and Quai. Hein and Quai. Hein and Quai. Okay, so today we are testing out my new microphone and we are going to read a short clip. I've done as much as I can to just get it basically up. I'm really enthused. And we are going to be reading to you The Vampyre, a tale by Jean William Polidori. Supposedly the first English vampire story, English language vampire story. I believe there's another one before this, written by a black man. But unless John Polidori is black, and in which case this is it. London, printed for Sherwood, Neely and Jones, Paternoster Row, 1819. Entered at Stationers' Hall, March 27th, 1819. Gillett, Printer, Crown Court, Fleet Street, London. Extract of a letter from Geneva. I breathe freely in the neighborhood of this lake. The ground upon which I tread has been subdued from the early ages. The principal objects which immediately strike my eye bring to my recollection scenes in which man acted the hero and was the chief object of interest. Not to look back to earlier times of battles and sieges, here is the bust of Rousseau, here is a house with an inscription denoting that the Genevan philosopher first drew breath under its roof. A little out of town is Ferney, the residence of Voltaire, where that wonderful, though certainly in many respects contemptible character received, like the hermits of old, the visits of pilgrims, not only from his own nation, but from the furthest boundaries of Europe. Here, too, was Bonnet's abode, and a few steps beyond, the house of that astonishing woman, Madame de Stael, perhaps the first of her sex who has really proved its often claimed equality with the nobler men. We have before had women who had written interesting novels and poems in which their tact at observing drawing-room characters has availed them, but never since the days of Heloise have those faculties which are peculiar to man been developed as the possible inheritance of woman. Though even here, as in the case of Heloise, our sex have not been backward in alleging the existence of an Abelard in the person of M. Schlegel as the inspirer of her works, but to proceed upon the same side of the lake, Gibbon, Bonnivard, Bradshaw, and others mark, as it were, the stages for our progress. Whilst upon the other side there is one house built by Diodati, the friend of Milton, which has contained within its walls for several months that poem whom we have so often read together, and who, if human passions remain the same, and human feelings, like chords, on being swept by nature's impulses, shall vibrate as before, will be placed by posterity in the first rank of our English poets. You must have heard, or the third canto of Childe Harold will have informed you, that Lord Byron resided many months in this neighborhood. I went with some friends a few days ago, after having seen Ferney, to view this mansion. I trod the floors with the same feelings of awe and respect as we did together those of Shakespeare's dwelling at Stratford. I sat down in the chair of the salon, and satisfied myself that I was resting on what he had made his constant seat. I found a servant there who had lived with him. She, however, gave me little information. She pointed out his bedchamber upon the same level as the saloon and dining room, and informed me that he retired to rest at 3, got up at 2, and employed himself a long time over his toilette, that he never went to sleep without a pair of pistols and a dagger by his side, and that he never ate animal food. He apparently spent some part of every day upon the lake in an English boat. There was a balcony from the saloon which looks upon the lake and the mountain Jura, and I imagine that it must have been hence he contemplated the storm so magnificently described in the third canto, for you have from here a most extensive view of all the points he has therein depicted. I can fancy him like the scathed pine, whilst all around was sunk to repose, still waking to observe what gave but a weak image of the storms which had desolated his own breast. The sky is changed, and such a change, O night and storm and darkness, ye are wondrous strong, yet lovely in your strength, as is the light of a dark eye in woman. Far along, from peak to peak, the rattling crags among, leaps the lyre thunder, Not from one lone cloud, but every mountain now hath found a tongue, and Jura answers thro' her misty shroud back to the joyous Alps, who call to her aloud. And this is in the night, most glorious night. Thou wert not sent for slumber, let me be a sharer in thy far and fierce delight, a portion of the tempest and of me. How the lit lake shines, a phosphoric sea, and the big rain comet dancing to the earth. And now again 'tis black, and now the glee of the loud hills shakes with its mountain mirth, as if they did rejoice o'er a young earthquake's birth. Now, where the swift Rhine cleaves his way between heights, which appear as lovers who have parted in haste, whose mining depths so intervene that they can meet no more, though broken-hearted, though in their souls which thus each other thwarted, love was the very root of the fond rage which blighted their life's bloom, and then departed, itself expired, believing them an age of years all winter war within themselves to wage. I went down to the little port, if I may use the expression therein his vessel used to lay, and conversed with the cottager who had the care of it. You may smile, but I have my pleasure in thus helping my personification of the individual I admire by attaining to the knowledge of those circumstances which were daily around him. I have made numerous inquiries in the town concerning him, but can learn nothing. He only went into society there once, when M. Pictet took him to the house of a lady to spend the evening. They say he is a very singular man, and seem to think of him very uncivil. Amongst other things, they relate that having invited M. Pictet and Bottington to dinner, he went on to the lake to Chillon, leaving a gentleman who travelled with him to receive them and make his apologies. Another evening, being invited to the house of Lady D.H., he promised to attend, but upon approaching the windows of her ladyship's villa, and perceiving the room to be full of company, he set down his friend, desiring him to plead his excuse, and immediately returned home. This will serve as a contradiction to the report which you tell me is current in England, of his having been avoided by his countrymen on the continent. The case happens to be directly the reverse, as he has been generally sought by them, though on most occasions apparently without success. It is said, indeed, that upon paying his first visit at Coppet, following the servant who had announced his name, he was surprised to meet a lady carried out fainting. But before he had been seated many minutes, the same lady who had been so affected at the sound of his name returned and conversed with him a considerable time. Such is female curiosity and affectation. He visited Coppet frequently, and of course associated there with several of his countrymen who evidenced no reluctance to meet him, whom his enemies alone would represent as an outcast. Though I have been so unsuccessful in this town, I have been more fortunate in my inquiries elsewhere. There is a society three or 4 miles from Geneva, the center of which is the Countess of Bros, a Russian lady well acquainted with the accoutrements de la société, and who had collected them round herself at her mansion. It was chiefly here, I find, that the gentleman who travelled with Lord Byron as physician sought for society. He used almost every day to cross the lake by himself in one of their flat-bottomed boats, and returned after passing the evening with his friends about 11 or 12 at night, often whilst the storms were raging in the circling summits of the mountains around. He had become intimate from long acquaintance with several of the families in the neighbourhood. I have gathered from their accounts some excellent traits of his lordship's character, which I will relate to you at some future opportunity. I must, however, free from him one imputation attached to him, of having in his house 2 sisters as the partakers of his revels. This is, like many other charges which have been brought against his lordship, entirely destitute of truth. His only companion was the physician I have already mentioned. The report originated from the following circumstance. Mr. Percy Bysshe Shelley, a gentleman well known for extravagance of doctrine and for his daring in their profession, even to sign himself with the title of Atheos in the album at Chamonix, having taken a house below, in which he resided with Miss M. W. Godwin and her, Miss Clermont, the daughters of the celebrated Mr. Godwin. They were frequently visitors of Diodati, and were often seen upon the lake with his lordship, which gave rise to the report that truth of which is here now positively denied. Among other things, which the lady from whom I procured these anecdotes related to me, she mentioned the outline of a ghost story by Lord Byron. It appears that one evening Lord B., Mr. P.B. Shelley, and two ladies, and the gentleman before alluded to, after having perused a German work which was entitled Phantasmagoriana, began relating ghost stories, when his lordship, having recited the beginning of Christabel, then unpublished, the whole took so strong a hold of Mr. Shelley's mind that he suddenly started up and ran out of the room. The physician and Lord Byron followed, and discovered him leaning against a mantelpiece with cold drops of perspiration trickling down his face. After having given him something to refresh him, upon inquiring into the cause of his alarm, they found that his wild imagination having pictured to him the bosom of the two ladies with eyes, which was reported of a lady in the neighborhood where he lived, he obliged to leave the room in order to destroy the impression. It was again afterwards proposed, in the course of conversation, that each of the company present should write a tale depending upon some supernatural agency, which was undertaken by Lord B., the physician, and Miss M. W. Godwin. My friend, the lady above referred to, had in her possession the outline of each of these stories. I obtained them as a great favor, and herewith forward them to you, as I was assured you would feel as much curiosity as myself to peruse the embouche of so great a genius and those immediately under his influence. The Vampyre. Introduction. The superstition upon which this tale is founded is very general in the East. Among the Arabians it appears to be common. It did not, however, extend itself to the Greeks until after the establishment of Christianity, and it is, only assumed its presence formed since the division of the Latin and Greek churches, at which time the idea becoming prevalent that a Latin body could not corrupt if buried in their territory. It had gradually increased and formed the subject of many wonderful stories, still extant, of the dead rising from their graves and feeding upon the blood of the young and beautiful. In the West it spread, with some slight variation, all over Hungary, Poland, Austria, and Lorraine, where the belief existed that vampires nightly imbibed a certain portion of the blood of their victims, who became emaciated, lost their strength, and speedily died of consumptions, whilst these human bloodsuckers fattened, and their veins became distended to such a state of repletion as to cause the blood to flow from all the passages of their bodies, and even from the very pores of their skins. In the London Journal of March 1732 is a curious and, of course, credible account of a particular case of vampirism, which is stated to have occurred at Madryaga in Hungary. It appears that upon an examination of the commander-in-chief and magistrates of the place, they positively and unanimously confirmed, about 5 years before, a certain hayduke named Arnold Paul had been heard to say that at Kasovia, on the frontiers of the Turkish Servia, he had been tormented by a vampire, but had found a way to rid himself of the evil by eating some of the earth out of the vampire's grave and rubbing himself with his blood. This precaution, however, did not prevent him from becoming a vampire himself. For about 20 or 30 days after his death and burial, many persons complained of having been tormented by him, and a deposition was made that 4 persons had been deprived of life by his attacks. To prevent further mischief, the inhabitants, having consulted their Hadagani, took up the body and found in it, as is supposed to be usual in the cases of vampirism, fresh and entirely free from corruption, and emitting at the mouth, nose, and ears pure and florid blood. Proof having been thus obtained, they resorted to the accustomed remedy. A stake was driven entirely through the heart and body of Arnold Paul, at which he is reported to have cried out as dreadfully as if he had been alive. This done, they cut off his head, burned his body, and threw the ashes into the grave. The same measures were adopted with the corpses of those persons who had previously died from vampirism, lest they should in their turn become agents upon others who survived them. The universal belief is that a person sucked by a vampire becomes a vampire himself and sucks in return. This monstrous rodomontade is here related because it seems better adapted to illustrate the subject of the present observations than any other instance that could be adduced. In many parts of Greece, it is considered as sort of a punishment after death for some heinous crime committed whilst in existence, that the deceased is not only doomed to vampirize, but compelled to confine his infernal visitations solely to those beings he loved most while upon the earth, those to whom he was bound by ties of kindred and affection, a supposition alluded to in the Giaour. But first on earth as vampire sent, thy corse shall from its tomb be rent, then ghastly haunt the native place, and suck the blood of all thy race. There from thy daughter, sister, wife, at midnight drain the stream of life, yet loathe the banquet which, perforce, must feed thy living corpse. Thy victims ere they yet expire shall know the demon for their sire, as cursing thee, thou cursing them. Thy flowers are withered on the stem, but one that for thy crime must fall, the youngest, best beloved of all, shall bless thee with a father's name. That word shall wrap thy heart in flame. Yet thou must end thy task and mark her cheek's last tinge, her eyes' last spark, and the last glassy glance must view, which freezes over its lifeless blue. Then with unhallowed hand shall tear the tresses of her yellow hair, of which in life a lock when shorn, affection's fondest pledge was worn, but now is borne away by thee, memorial of thine agony. Yet with thine own best blood shall drip thy gnashing tooth and haggard lip. Then stalking to thy sullen grave, go and with ghouls and afrits rave, till these in horror shrink away from spectre more accursed than they. Mr. Southey had also introduced in his wild but beautiful poem Talaba, the vampire course of the Arabian maid Oniza, who was represented as having returned from the grave for the purpose of tormenting him she best loved whilst in existence. But this cannot be supposed to have resulted from the sinfulness of her life, she being portrayed throughout the whole of the tale as a complete type of purity and innocence. The voracious Tournefort gives a long account in his travels of several astonishing cases of vampirism, to which he pretends to have been an eyewitness, and comment in his great works upon the subject, besides a variety of anecdotes and traditionary narratives, illustrates of its effects. Has put forth some learned dissertations tending to prove it to be a classical as well as barbarian error. Many curious and interesting notices on this singularly horrible superstition must be added, though the present may suffice for its limits of a note necessarily devoted to explanation, and which may now be concluded by merely remarking that though the term vampire is the one in general acceptation, there are several others synonymous with it, made use of in various parts of the world, as vrukolocha, vardulaka, ghoul, brukoloka, etc. The vampire. It happened that in the midst of the dissipations attended upon a London winter, there appeared at various parties of the leaders of the ton of noblemen, more remarkable for his singularities than his rank. He gazed upon the mirth around him, as if he could not participate therein. Apparently the light laughter of the fair only attracted his attention, that he might by a look quell it and throw fear into those breasts where thoughtlessness reigned. Those who felt this sensation of awe could not explain whence it arose. Some attributed it to the dead gray eye which, fixing upon the object's face, did not seem to penetrate, and at one glance to pierce through the inward workings of the heart. But it fell upon the cheek with a leaden ray that waited upon the skin it could not pass. His peculiarities caused him to be invited to every house. All wished to see him, and those who had been accustomed to violent excitement and now felt the weight of ennui were were pleased at having something in their presence capable of engaging their attention. In spite of the deadly hue of his face, which never gained a warmer tint, either from the blush of modesty nor the passion, the strong emotion of passion, though his form and outline were beautiful, many of the female hunters, after notoriety, attempted to win his attentions and gain at least some marks of what they might term affection. Lady Mercer, who had been the mockery of every monster shrewn in drawing rooms since her marriage, threw herself in his way and did all but put on the dress of a mountebank to attract his notice, though in vain. When she stood before him, though his eyes were apparently fixed on hers, still it seemed as if they were unperceived. Even her unappalled impudence was baffled, and she left the field. But though the common adulteress could not influence even the guidance of his eyes, it was not that the female sex was indifferent to him, yet such was the apparent caution with which he spoke to the virtuous wife and innocent daughter that few knew he ever addressed himself to females. He had, however, the reputation of a winning tongue, and whether it was that even overcame the dread of his singular character, or that they were moved by his apparent hatred of vice, he was often among those females who form the boast of their sex from their domestic virtues, as among those who sully it by their vices. About the same time, though, there came to London a young gentleman of the name of Aubrey. He was an orphan left with an only sister in the possession of great wealth, by parents who died while he was yet in childhood, left also to himself by guardians who thought it was their duty merely to take care of his fortune, while they relinquished the more important charge of his mind to the care of mercenary subalterns. He cultivated more his imagination than his judgment. He had hints that high romantic feeling of honor and candor which daily ruins so many milliners' apprentices. He believed all to sympathize with virtue, and thought that vice was thrown in by Providence merely for the picturesque effect of the scene, as if we see in romances. He thought that the misery of the cottage merely consisted in the vesting of clothes which were as warm, but which were better adapted by the painter's eye by their irregular folds and various colored patches. He thought, in fine, that the dreams of the poets were the realities of life. He was handsome, frank, and rich. For those reasons, upon his entering into gay circles, many mothers surrounded him, striving which should describe with least truth their languishing or romping features. Alright, I had to pause this to interject that I changed the 48 volt to also the 48 in the air, so if it sounds like it's picking up more highs over the last few minutes, then great, it's doing what it's supposed to do. So back to the story. He was handsome, frank, and rich. For these reasons, upon his entering into the gay circles, many mothers surrounded him, striving which would describe with least truth their languishing or romping favorites, the daughters at the same time, by their brightening countenances when he approached, and by their sparkling eyes when he opened his lips, soon led him into false notions of his talents and his merit. Attached as he was to the romance of his solitary hours, he was startled at finding that, except in the tallow and wax candles that flickered not from the presence of a ghost but from want of snuffing, there was no foundation in real life for any of the congeries of pleasing pictures and descriptions contained in those volumes from which he had formed his studies. Finding, however, some compensation in his gratified vanity, he was about to relinquish his dreams when the extraordinary being we have above described crossed him in his career. He watched him, and the very impossibility of forming an idea of the character of a man entirely absorbed in himself, who gave few other signs of his observation of external objects than the tacit assent to their existence implied by the avoidance of their contact, allowing his imagination to picture everything that flattered its propensity to extravagant ideas. He soon formed his object into the hero of a romance, and determined to observe the offspring of his fancy rather than the person before him. He became acquainted with him, paid him attentions, and so far advanced upon his notice that his presence was always recognized. He gradually learnt that Lord Ruthven's affairs were embarrassed, and soon found from the notes of preparation in Street. He was about to travel, desirous of gaining some information respecting this singular character who till now had only whetted his curiosity. He hinted to his guardians that it was time for him to perform the tour, which for many generations has been necessary to enable the young to take some rapid steps in the career of vice towards putting themselves upon an equality with the aged, and not allowing them to appear as if they've fallen from the skies whenever scandalous intrigues are mentioned as the subjects of pleasantry or of praise, according to the degree of skill shown in carrying them on. They consented, and Aubrey, immediately mentioning his intentions to Lord Ruthven, was surprised to receive from him a proposal to join him. Flattered by such a remark of esteem from him, who apparently had nothing in common with other men, he gladly accepted it, and in a few days they had passed the circling waters. Hitherto, Aubrey had had no opportunity of studying Lord Ruthven's character, and now he found that though many more of his actions were exposed to his view, the results offered different conclusions from the apparent motives to his conduct. His companion was profuse in his liberality. The idle, the vagabond, and the beggar received from his hand more than enough to relieve their immediate wants. But Aubrey could not avoid remarking that it was not upon the virtuous reduced to indigence by the misfortunes attendant even upon virtue that he bestowed his alms. These were sent from the door with hardly suppressed sneers. But when the profligate came to ask something, not to relieve his wants, but to allow him to wallow in his lust, or to sink him still deeper in his iniquity, he was sent away with rich charity. This was, however, attributed by him to the greater importunity of the vicious, which generally prevails over the retiring bashfulness of the virtuous indigent. There was one circumstance about the charity of his lordship which was still impressed upon his mind. All those upon whom it was bestowed inevitably found that there was a curse upon it, for they were all either led to the scaffold or sunk to the lowest in the most abject misery. At Brussels and other towns, though which they had passed, Aubrey was surprised at the apparent eagerness for which his companions sought for the centres of all fashionable vice. There he entered into all the spirit of the faro table. He betted and always gambled with success, except where the known sharper was his antagonist, and then he lost even more than he gained, but it was always with the same unchanging face with which he generally watched the society around. It was not, however, so when he encountered the rash youthful novice or the luckless father of a numerous family, then his very wish seemed fortune's law. This apparent abstractedness of mind was laid aside, and his eyes sparkled with more fire than that of the cat whilst dallying with the half-dead mouse. In every town he left, the formerly affluent youth torn from the circle he adorned, cursing in the solitude of a dungeon the fate that had drawn him within the reach of this fiend, whilst many a father sat frantic among the speaking looks of mute, hungry children, without a single farthing of his late immense wealth wherewith to buy even sufficient to satisfy their present craving. Yet he took no money from the gambling table, but immediately lost, to the ruiner of many, the last guilder he had just snatched from the convulsive grasp of the innocent. This might but be the result of a certain degree of knowledge which was not, however, capable of combating the cunning of the more experienced. Aubrey often wished to represent this to his friend and beg him to resign that charity and pleasure which proved the ruin of all and did not tend to his own profit, but he delayed it, for each day he hoped his friend would give him some opportunity to speak frankly and openly to him. However, this never occurred. Lord Ruthven, in his carriage and amidst the various wild and rich scenes of nature, was always the same. His eye spoke less than his lip, and though Aubrey was nearer the subject of his curiosity, he obtained no greater gratification from it than the constant excitement of vainly wishing to break that mystery, which to his exalted imagination began to assume the appearance of something supernatural. They soon arrived at Rome, and Aubrey for a time lost sight of his companion. He left him in daily attendance upon the morning circle of an Italian countess, whilst he went in search of some memorials of another almost deserted city. Whilst he was thus engaged, letters arrived from England, which he opened with eager impatience. The first was from his sister, breathing nothing but affection. The others were from his guardians. The latter astonished him. If it had before entered into his imagination that there was an evil power resident in his companion, these seemed to give him sufficient reason for this belief. His guardians insisted upon his immediately leaving his friend, and urged that this character was dreadfully vicious, for that the possession of irresistible powers of seduction rendered his licentious habits more dangerous to society. It had been discovered that his contempt for the adulteress had not originated in hatred of her character, but that he had required to enhance his gratification that his victim, the partner of his guilt, should be hurled from the pinnacle of unsullied virtue down to the lowest abyss of infamy and degradation. In fine, that all those females whom he had sought apparently on account of their virtue had since his departure thrown even the mask aside, and had not scrupled to expose the whole deformity of their vices to the public gaze. Aubrey determined upon leaving one whose character had not yet shown a single bright point on which to rest the eye. He resolved to invent some plausible pretext for abandoning him altogether, proposing in the meanwhile to watch him more closely and to let no slight circumstances pass by unnoticed. He entered into the same circle, and soon perceived that his lordship was endeavouring to work upon the inexperience of the daughter of the lady whose house he chiefly frequented. I'm not going to edit that out. I hope you're having fun. You're listening to Hide and Inquire. Hi, say hi and inquire. Good job. All right. In Italy, it is seldom that an unmarried female is met with in society. He was therefore obliged to carry on his plans in secret, but Aubrey's eyes followed him in all the windings, and soon discovered that an assignation had been appointed, which would most likely end in the ruin of an innocent, though thoughtless girl. Losing no time, he entered the apartment of Lord Ruthven, and abruptly asked him his intentions with respect to the lady, informing him at the same time that he was aware of his being about to meet her that very night. Lord Ruthven answered that his intentions were such as he supposed all would have upon such an occasion, and upon being pressed whether he intended to marry her, merely laughed. Aubrey retired, and immediately writing a note to say that from the moment he must decline accompanying his lordship in the remainder of their proposed tour, he ordered his servant to seek other apartments, and calling upon the mother of the lady, informed her of all he knew, not only with regard to her daughter, but also concerning the character of his lordship. The assignation was prevented. Lord Ruffin next day merely sent his servant to notify his complete assent to a separation, but did not hint any suspicion of his plans having been foiled by Aubrey's interposition. Having left Rome, Aubrey directed his steps towards Greece, and crossing the peninsula soon found himself at Athens. He then fixed his residence in the house of a Greek, and soon occupied himself in tracing the faded records of ancient glory upon monuments that, apparently ashamed of chronicling the deeds of freemen only before slaves, had hidden themselves beneath the sheltering soil or many-colored lichen. Under the same roof as himself existed a being so beautiful and delicate that she might have formed. Alright, this is my laptop microphone. That's all I have for now. My app kept crashing. So this is the microphone test of my SE VR2 through the Focusrite Solo 3. And thanks for listening.